investigation. Always trust your gut.
Hello, my name is Chrissy Champagne. You are listening to Residue, a true crime podcast dedicated to keeping you paranoid. Residue is not just another true crime podcast, but a necessary tool for those who want to understand the dangers lurking in the real world. Residue is created, hosted, edited, researched, and produced by me, Chrissy Champagne. If you would love to help out the show, the best thing to do would be hit that follow button and also leave a 5-star review. If you do leave a 5-star review, I will be mailing out cute little stickers and thank you notes because I do appreciate you all so very much. And you can follow me on Instagram at Residue Podcast, Facebook Residue A True Crime Podcast, and TikTok at Chrissy Champagne or Residue A True Crime Podcast. Okay, so now that we got all of that out of the way, let's get into our story today. And as you know, listener discretion is always advised. When police arrived at the Roy Rogers on Route 1 in Falls Township, Pennsylvania, the scene inside was chaotic. 25-year-old Terri Brooks, the night manager, lay near the kitchen, face down in a pool of blood. A butcher knife was still lodged in her neck. Her winter coat was still on, her purse nearby on the floor. Her shoes, they were several feet away, flung up against a wall. Investigators believed she had been pushed out of her shoes during a violent struggle. Her hands were bloodied. There were bruises all over her body and strangulation marks around her neck. And later, it was revealed Terri had still been alive when a plastic bag was placed over her head. The restaurant's safe had been opened, coins were scattered across the office floor, and over $2,500 was missing. But there was no sign of forced entry. The main doors were locked. Only the drive-through window, partially open, hinted at a possible exit route. Whoever did this may have crawled out of that window to escape. Police estimated the murder happened sometime after midnight, once the restaurant closed. And back at her family home, the morning began with a creeping unease. Terri's parents realized something was wrong when her fiancé, Scott Keefe, knocked on their door at 6 a.m. He said he had been driving by on his way to work and noticed that Terri's car wasn't in the driveway, and he just wanted to check in, see if she's at home. Her parents run up to her room, and she wasn't there. So they called the restaurant and they asked, "Is Terri okay?" And the voice on the other end of the line didn't even hesitate. They say, "No, she was murdered." Over the phone, just like that, no warning, no police at the door, just a sudden, brutal fact that would haunt this family forever. Terri Lynn Brooks was born December 9th, 1958. She grew up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, the oldest of 4 children. When her parents divorced in her teens, she stepped up and became the mom of her younger sisters because her mother left. Terri was always reliable, always ambitious. Terri worked her way up in the restaurant industry and eventually became a manager at Roy Rogers. Her coworkers respected her and she was proud of her job, but she had bigger dreams. To move into the hotel business, and she was interviewing at the Marriott. She had just gotten engaged to Scott Keefe, the restaurant's head chef, and it happened fast. It was a whirlwind romance, but by all accounts, they were in love. Terri had already put down a deposit on a honeymoon in Hawaii, and she and Scott were looking for apartments. Her summer wedding was just months away. So who would do this to her? Her family and fiance were cooperative with the police. Scott told investigators that he hadn't been at work that night. He usually stayed with Terri when she closed late, and he wanted to be there with her because, he was a little nervous. She's always working the night shift. But on this particular night, Scott stayed home because he had to open the restaurant the next day, so he wanted to be rested up. No one in Terri's life believed that she was in danger. She had no enemies, there were no signs of trouble, no known conflicts. It just seemed unthinkable. So obviously the first thing on detectives' minds is this just a robbery gone wrong? Or was it something else entirely? Because this was a brutal crime. There was money stolen, yeah, but they brutally murdered Terri. Whoever did this really did not like her. But police think there's got to be more to this story, so their attention turns to the place where it all happened, the Roy Rogers fast food restaurant, and all of the employees that were working had to be interviewed. And it is then during those interviews that police find out that Terri had quite a reputation at work. She was tough, but she was professional. A manager who took her job seriously, and Terri did not tolerate any nonsense. For most employees, that was something that they could deal with, that they respected. But for one employee in particular, this was personal. His name was Steve Daly. He was a former Marine. He was angry, short-tempered. Employees said that he was the kind of man who didn't like being told what to do, especially by a woman. Sounds like a real treat to work with. And just weeks before the murder, things between Terri and Steve came to a breaking point. It all started when Steve was asked to make a hamburger. And now Steve already clocked out. He already cleaned the grill, so he lost his shit. He's yelling and cursing. He even calls Terri, his manager, a bitch in front of everyone. But Terri stayed calm. She told him to go home. She didn't want to do anything rash. She just said, listen, Steve, your day here is over. Go home. We will talk about this in the morning. And the next day, she reported him to her own supervisor, and she told her supervisor everything that Steve did, and that supervisor fired Steve Daly that day. But Steve didn't stay gone, so he keeps showing up to the restaurant all of the time, eating there, lingering, trying to intimidate Terri. To police, this seems like the perfect suspect. He had motive, he knew the layout, he had military training. When Steve was brought in for questioning, he didn't deny the conflict. In fact, he leaned into the conflict. He said, if Terri was a man, I would have punched her. And he knew that if he was just in the restaurant eating, there was nothing Terri could do about it. She couldn't kick him out. But he did claim to police that the only reason he did keep coming back to Roy Rogers was because he was actually dating someone who worked there. I mean, police didn't buy his bullshit, but as for his alibi the night of the murder, Steve said he was trying to get into a local nightclub that night, but he wasn't able to get in. So he just ended up driving around all night. And detectives, of course, go to the nightclub. They check the surveillance footage from the club, and there's no sign of Steve anywhere in any of this footage. So Steve is looking like suspect number one right now. But he does agree to take a polygraph test. And you have to remember, this is the 1980s. And Steve passes this polygraph test. So Steve Daly is no longer their prime suspect. Detectives start looking back to the staff who had worked that night. And there were 4 employees who were scheduled alongside Terri: Patricia, Ron, Barb, and Dan. And one by one, each was interviewed and fingerprinted. So Patricia actually gives police a very important clue. She tells them that just before closing, Terri noticed that $40 was missing from Barb's cash register. So tensions are rising, and Terri, of course, had no tolerance for stealing. She demanded answers. She wanted to know who the hell took the $40 from that till. And Barb denied everything. And not only denied it, but then she starts pointing the finger at Ron, the other employee. And then Ron denies it too. He said, I don't even have any cash on me. Look, he's like turning his jean pockets inside out to prove it. And this was just like minor workplace drama. I mean, it was $40. So could someone have done this over $40? But then police find Ron's fingerprints, and they find them not just on the drive-through window, but also on the plastic bag that was wrapped around Terri's head. I mean, come on. So detectives are pressing him, and Ron said, look, guys, I handle the trash. It's part of my job. I would have had to have touched one of those bags. And I am the one that covers the drive-through when people have to take a break. So of course my fingerprints are all over it. And then police are like, well, how well do they clean the restaurant at the end of the night? You know, it is possible that Ron's fingerprints are still on the drive-through window. They checked his alibi, and his alibi was that he got home from work at around 1:15 a.m. He actually left work with some other employees, and they all walked out to their cars together. Then he said he went home, and his mom was still up, so they had a little conversation. That was his alibi. So police go and check it out, and they find out that, yes, Ron did leave with everyone else, and Ron's mom says he did come home. They did talk, so Ron was cleared. And another key point to mention is that missing $40, it actually turned up back in the safe mysteriously that night before anyone left the restaurant. So suspicion now shifts to Barb. She's the one that closed down the drive-thru that night. She's the one who had the missing $40 in her till to begin with. And police start to think, was it possible that Barb stole the money, and then she maybe argued with Terri about it, and then she leaves the drive-through window cracked open a little bit, and then she comes back into the restaurant, has a confrontation with Terri. But Barb also had an alibi. Her boyfriend picked her up right after work and drove her home. And by the time Terri was killed, she was all alone inside of that restaurant doing inventory. She was the last one inside Roy Rogers. When Terri's autopsy report comes back, it confirms everything that police feared. She was strangled, massive head trauma, and she had a severed vertebrae from the knife. And the absolute most horrifying part of the autopsy was the fact that Terri was conscious, but paralyzed when the plastic bag was wrapped around her head, and her cause of death was asphyxiation. This wasn't just a killing. This is overkill. This is rage. This is someone that wanted to be absolutely sure that Terri was dead. And that made everyone wonder, was this personal? Or was this a predator that was targeting women in fast food restaurants? Because just 2 weeks after Terri's murder, an assistant manager at another Roy Rogers was attacked. She was blindsided after stepping out of the bathroom. She was hit over the head and she fell to the ground. She couldn't get a look at who did this to her, but the person ran off and she survived. But a week later in Scranton, where I was born, a female employee was working alone when a man entered. He tried the safe, but it had already been emptied. So he told this woman that he wanted all of her money, give him all of the money she has on her, and she did. And then he stabbed her to death. I mean, the similarities to these cases were just way too close to Terri's case. The police could not ignore this. They start to believe that there could be a serial killer hunting women in the fast food service industry. A man named Steve Duffy was arrested in Scranton, but when Falls Township detectives tried to question him, he'd already lawyered up. So they got a warrant for his fingerprints, and it was not a match to any of the fingerprints that were found at Terri's crime scene. And the other attacker from the second Roy Rogers, he was also cleared. And with that, the trail in Terri Brooks' case went cold. For 14 years, the murder of Terri Brooks haunted her family, her friends, and the Falls Township community. The case sat cold. No closure, no justice, until 1998. That year, a new police chief took over the Falls Township Police Department, and he made the bold decision to take a fresh look at old unsolved homicides. And one of those cases was Terri Brooks. With DNA science finally catching up to the promise of justice, the case was reassigned to prosecutor Lori Markle. And as she sifted through the evidence, something unexpected happened. She says that when she opened a sealed bag containing Terri's personal effects, Terri's wallet was inside. And when she opened that wallet still carried the faint scent of Terri's perfume. Lori was stunned, and after 14 years, it was like Terri was right there in the room with her. And then she knew this case wasn't just about evidence and reports, it was personal. She felt a connection to Terri. So investigators had long leaned toward the robbery theory, but now with DNA on the table, Markle took a different approach. Victimology. This is rebuilding the full picture of Terri's life and relationships. So the prosecutor says many of the people interviewed back in the 1980s were teenagers. They were young adults heading into their 20s. But maybe now, as adults with their own families, maybe now they'd share more info. And one person did. Cindy, Terri's very close friend and ex-coworker. Cindy sat down for a new interview, and what she revealed changed everything. In the original investigation, Terri's relationship with her fiancé, Scott Keefe, was painted as loving and stable. But her best friend Cindy said the opposite. She said that Terri was planning to call off the wedding. She had cold feet and she was scared to tell Scott. According to her sisters, the relationship was never right. Scott was possessive, jealous, and always drinking. He tried to isolate Terri from her friends and family. And back in 1984, Terri's family had no reason to doubt him. But now, they started to see the signs. Scott had motive. He knew the restaurant inside and out, and he often closed with Terri at night. So could he have snapped? Investigators combed through the physical evidence, and they see that on Terri's right ring finger, where she had a defensive wound, they found a trace of male DNA. And now, in 1984, that meant nothing. But in 1998, this means everything. But investigators are trying to figure out, how are we going to get a DNA sample from Scott Keefe without tipping him off? Investigators learned that Scott smoked cigarettes, and they also knew that under Pennsylvania law, discarded trash is considered abandoned property. In 1998, Scott was divorced and living back home with his mother, so police set up surveillance, and they retrieved Scott's trash, and inside it, they found cigarette butts, and the DNA was tested, and it was a match. The DNA from Terri's ring finger was Scott Keefe's, her fiancé. Police invited Scott to the station on the anniversary of Terri's murder. They figured that if they brought him in on the anniversary date, that this might heighten his anxiety and he would talk. They told him they were reviewing old leads. They wanted him to think he was helping, that they still saw him as the grieving fiancé. And so Scott came to the interview, and he spoke lovingly about Terri. He said that she was the love of his life. But detectives had a strategy. They didn't come at Scott aggressively. They slowly built pressure until they asked, would you be willing to take a polygraph? And Scott agreed. And Scott failed. And that's when everything cracked in Scott's story. He starts saying things like, I didn't mean for this to happen. And then he says, she came at me first. So Scott confesses. And after 14 years, the truth finally came out. Terri Brooks hadn't died in a random robbery gone wrong. She was killed by the man that she was supposed to marry. Scott tells the detectives that he was told that Terri wanted to break up with him, and he became enraged. He became so enraged that he punched his fiancée right in the face. Then they struggled, and while they were struggling, a knife fell off one of the prep tables to the floor. That is when he knocked Terri down to the floor, straddled her, and then choked her while he banged her head against the floor. Then he stuck that knife into her throat. And she was still breathing, so he needed to take care of that. He wrapped a trash bag around her neck. He says he wanted to make sure she was dead, but he also didn't want to look at her face. And then he went into the safe, stole the money, made it look like a robbery by jumping out the drive-through window, and he wanted to make himself look innocent, so he went to her family's home. And he acted like he had no idea where Terri was, and her family was surrounding him. The crime is discovered. Everyone thinks that Scott's innocent because he is standing there with the family grieving at the same time. Scott Keefe is charged with first-degree murder, and he is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison on June 6th, 2000. Scott Keefe got away with murdering his fiancée for 16 years. Terri Brooks was a woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had dreams, goals, a career she loved, and this was all taken away by someone who put a ring on her finger and claimed to love her. Until next time, stay safe and stay paranoid. Stay paranoid.